Emma stepped into the dim, musty house that had been her grandmother's home for as long as she could remember. Shadows stretched across walls adorned with family photographs, their sepia tones blending into the faded wallpaper. There was a solemn stillness to the place, as though time itself had slowed in respect for the lives once lived here. The living room, dominated by an old stone fireplace, seemed untouched, save for a single photograph on the mantelpiece, the image of her grandmother, eyes bright and warm, caught in a rare, gentle smile. Emma felt a pang of nostalgia as she took in the image, one she'd seen countless times as a child. Now, it struck her as almost eerie in the silence of the house, as if her grandmother were watching, her gaze following Emma's every move. Emma shook off the unsettling feeling, chalking it up to grief and the strange sensation of living in a space still full of someone else's life. With her family's encouragement, she moved in, intent on honoring her grandmother's memory. But as the days went by, an uneasy feeling seemed to settle over the house, tugging at her thoughts. Days passed, each blending into the next, but one thing remained constant, that photograph on the mantel, always catching Emma's eye. One morning, as she passed by, she paused. Her grandmother's smile seemed different. The once bright eyes now appeared slightly tense, as though they were strained or unfocused. Emma squinted, telling herself it was simply her imagination. She assumed it was a product of her emotions amplifying every small detail. But each time she looked, more subtle changes seemed to take place. The gentle expression she remembered so well appeared tighter, almost grim. Shadows gathered around her grandmother's face in a way that made her look gaunt, even fearful. Emma's heart began to beat a little faster each time she walked past. She told herself it was a trick of the light, yet her mind kept returning to the unsettling image. As the days passed, a faint, inexplicable chill seemed to cling to the living room, lingering long after she'd left. It wasn't long before her family members began noticing too. Her younger sister, Clara, was the first to say something. "Emma, have you seen Grandma's picture? It doesn't look right." Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, her wide eyes fixed on the photograph. Emma had no choice but to admit that she'd seen it as well, though she hadn't wanted to speak of it out loud. Soon, it wasn't only the photograph that felt wrong. In the quiet hours of the night, Emma would wake to the faint sound of whispers echoing through the halls. Once, she could have sworn she heard her grandmother's voice, softly yet strained, calling her name. Cold drafts moved through the room, causing shivers that had nothing to do with the temperature. Each night brought a deeper sense of dread that seeped into her dreams, leaving her feeling trapped in her own home. It was as if her grandmother's presence were pressing down on her. The photograph itself continued to change, growing more grotesque with each passing day. Her grandmother's face now seemed to hold a pained expression, her eyes wide with desperation, her mouth pulled tight. Emma's unease turned to fear as she felt her grandmother's spirit reaching out, locked in some torment she couldn't understand. Determined to make sense of the haunting changes, Emma dove into her grandmother's belongings. She combed through old letters, family albums, and finally a small, faded leather journal tucked away in the bottom of a drawer. As she opened it, Emma discovered her grandmother's private fears, scrawled in hasty, trembling handwriting. Her grandmother had written about strange visions, fears of an unsettled afterlife, and an unsettling conviction that their family was cursed. One entry, written shortly before her death, stood out. "I feel them around me, pulling me to something dark. I don't know if peace is meant for me. My family never believed my fears, but if they only knew." The words haunted Emma, confirming the terror she'd felt since her first night in the house. She realized, with a sinking dread, that her grandmother may indeed be trapped in some spiritual limbo, desperate to communicate. Her family was skeptical, but Emma was determined. She would help her grandmother, no matter the cost. The journal contained descriptions of rituals and prayers. These rituals, according to the journal, might release a soul from torment, and Emma decided to try them, hoping they would ease her grandmother's suffering. Emma's attempts to free her grandmother's spirit only seemed to intensify the suffering captured in the photograph. She performed the rituals precisely as the journal instructed, but with each attempt, the image grew more horrific. Her grandmother's face became skeletal, her mouth open in a silent scream, eyes hollowed and dark. It was as if Emma's actions were tightening the chains around her grandmother's spirit rather than setting her free. Her family, now terrified, began to avoid the living room altogether, leaving Emma alone with the heavy weight of guilt. Clara, once eager to help, had withdrawn completely, too frightened to even look at the photograph. Emma felt a growing sense of responsibility for her grandmother's agony, convinced that her efforts to save her had somehow backfired. Nights became unbearable, filled with whispered pleas and faint, agonizing cries. The oppressive cold pressed down on her, making the air thick and heavy, as if her grandmother's suffering had seeped into every corner of the house. In desperation, Emma gathered her family one last time, determined to perform an exorcism that might release her grandmother once and for all. They surrounded the photograph, hands clasped, chanting words from the journal as Emma recited the final prayer. But halfway through, a wave of ice-cold air swept through the room, and the lights flickered. Emma's voice faltered as she felt something grasp at her, a sensation of emptiness and despair that seemed to penetrate to her core. In that moment, it became clear, the agony they saw wasn't caused by any curse, but by their own unresolved grief and guilt. In clinging so tightly to her memory, they had trapped her spirit, bound by their own unwillingness to let her go. Emma realized that their attempts to save her grandmother had only shackled her further to the earthly plane. Emma knew what she had to do. Setting aside her fear, she knelt before the photograph and spoke not to a spirit, but to the memory of her grandmother she had held captive in her heart. She confessed her guilt, her regrets, and her inability to believe in her grandmother's fears when she'd been alive. She told her grandmother that it was time to rest. She assured her that she would be remembered with love, not sadness or regret. As her words echoed through the room, Emma felt an odd warmth settle over her, replacing the suffocating cold. The photograph on the mantel softened, her grandmother's face relaxed, and her eyes closed peacefully. Emma watched, teary-eyed, as the photograph fell from the mantel and shattered on the floor, a final, quiet end. The days that followed felt brighter, as if the house itself had lifted from shadow. Emma felt peace, but also a lingering sadness as she cleaned up the shattered photograph, keeping only a small, happy image of her grandmother. She placed it back on the mantel, a gentle reminder of the life that had been lived here. As she turned to leave the room, Emma glanced back one last time, her eyes lingering on the photograph. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a faint shadow pass across it, a subtle, gentle presence. She paused, heart pounding, then decided to walk away, feeling both comforted and unsettled. Perhaps, she thought, some part of her grandmother's spirit still lingered, bound not by torment, but by love that could never truly fade.